Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and everyone has people in their lives who have a special impact on them, who actually help shape who they are and inspire them to be the best they can possibly be. And I get chills just saying this to you and thinking about the man I'm speaking with. For me, one of the greatest influences in my life, one of the models I believe reflects the finest in what a rabbi should be, and whose friendship and love has been a constant source of personal strength, whether I see him often or not, is a person who's devoted a lifetime of service to the Jewish people and the state of Israel and to our American society as a whole. He has been courageous, fearless, impassioned with a sense of purpose that has propelled him to speak softly but uncompromisingly truth to power. I get chills again. Being in the forefront of the fight on behalf of Soviet Jewry long before it was finally put on the formal agenda of Jewish organizational life. He was the personal rabbi for Avital Sharansky and for Natan. And the only time I was ever arrested, March 5th, 1985, was when I joined with him to protest at the Soviet mission in New York City on behalf of Natan Sharansky and the other brave Soviet refuseniks. I was moved by his taking a group of young people to Auschwitz to protest the establishment of a convent on Auschwitz grounds, to scale a fence wearing a talit, to have urine poured down upon him and those with him, and in the end, for winning that battle, as the Vatican ultimately decided that a convent did not have to be placed on ground hallowed most indelibly by Jewish blood and unfathomable human suffering. Wherever tragedy has struck our people or humanity, he is there, with words of comfort, words of hope, words of love. And then here in America, this extraordinary Orthodox rabbi has also dared to break barriers, to argue that one's commitment to halakha, traditional Jewish law, does not place observant Jews in an emotional or religious straitjacket, that the Jewish tradition has always embraced the notion of growth and a transcending sensitivity to the pains and challenges of life. And so he has championed the inclusion of women in Jewish Orthodox life. He was the first to ordain a woman to serve as a rabbi of an Orthodox congregation, and then with her, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz went on to create the first Orthodox rabbinical school for women, Yeshivat Maharat, and then was the founding dean of a rabbinical school for men, with an orientation that he describes in contrast to modern Orthodoxy as open Orthodoxy, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, YCT, a yeshiva for those who are lovers of Torah, again committed to halakha, while also maintaining an openness to modern culture and the broader sense of Jewish community, and sensitive to approaches across the Jewish spectrum. And if you're familiar with the names Yitz Greenberg and Shlomo Riskin and David Hartman, Saul Berman, you know the fabulous chevruta of bright, articulate, sensitive, innovative rabbis who all stood shoulder to shoulder in a quest to excite the Jewish mind and imagination, to inspire Jewish engagement and commitment, and to teach an authentic traditional sense of Torah, which again speaks to Jews across the Jewish community. And Avi Weiss was in that Jewish band of brothers, and he played a most distinctive and vital role. For I am convinced that Avi Weiss is the Nachshon of our time. I hope you remember that in the Midrash, Nachshon is credited for being the first to plunge into the Red Sea, causing it to split, enabling the children of Israel to be saved from Egyptian slaughter, and to then move forward to stand as one at the foot of Sinai to receive the Torah and to become the Jewish people. Nachshon ben Aminadav is the ultimate role model in Jewish life. Nachshon teaches us that one never sits on the sideline of life hoping for a miracle of divine intervention. It's all about people, individual people responding to the divine, who move forward against all the forces in our world which would seek to enslave the body and cripple the human spirit, the divine spark in every woman, child, and man on earth. It is the Nachshons of this world that break down walls, that inspire us to make this world a better place. And no one has done that more effectively than has Avi Weiss. Founding rabbi of the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, founder of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and Yeshivat Maharat, an activist rabbi who has been in the forefront of Jewish conscience for some 50 years. And Avi Weiss has also authored a marvelous book, a beautiful, easy read that brings chills and tears and pride on every page. It's entitled Open Up the Iron Door, Memoirs of a Soviet Jewish Activist. It's a must-read that should be in every Jewish library. It tells the story of one of the most important movements in Jewish history, perhaps the single most important Jewish movement of the 20th century, and describes Avi's personal journey from yeshivot, where there was no talk of the Shoah or of Jewish activism, to learning from the Abraham Joshua Heschels and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s the importance of nonviolent protest on behalf of suffering people, to his being influenced by Jacob Birnbaum and Glenn Richter, becoming the national president of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, and fighting the Jewish establishment, with his love-hate relationship with Meir Kahane, to his pure love of Avital and Natan, dancing at their wedding after Natan's dramatic release, of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that brought American foreign policy into the fight to save Soviet Jewry, and to that historic, bitter cold, gorgeous day when it seemed like all of Jewish America stood together in rally on the lawn underneath the Washington Monument in Washington, which Ronald Reagan credited for his learning that he had to insist that the doors be open for the Jews of the Soviet Union, and ultimate victory, which Avi Weiss reminds us belongs most to the refuseniks themselves, to the Yosef Mendeleviches and Ida Nudels, and then to all those few Jews worldwide, the Izzy Lieblers and the Ken Bialkins and the Shlomo Riskins and the Haskell Looksteins and countless others of the Jewish world, including the Triple SJ and Avi Weiss. And I'm also privileged to call Avi Weiss a friend, as do countless others who've been privileged to be part of his life. It is so wonderful to have you at this table. It is extraordinary, the lifetime of service you've given, and you're still going strong. I am so proud of you. I'm so proud to be in your world, to be your friend, and I hope you understand. Again, our paths move in different directions, and then every so often we're together. And whenever we're together, it's like we're brothers who've been there all our lives. I am so grateful to you. And again, kol hakavod to you, Yasher Koach. Just fabulous work you've done. And the book you've written is just fabulous.
Thank you.
So,
actually, Mark, I'm constantly with you because I am an avid viewer of JBS, and I hope your listeners, I hope they recognize how blessed they are and how blessed our community is. You, Mark, and this comes deep from within my heart and soul, you've opened up new paths. I think history will record that you created outlets of teaching and touching Jewish souls and beyond the Jewish community in an unbelievable way. The interviews that you do, it goes so far beyond the cryptic short interviews on Fox or CNN or MSNBC. They're thorough, they're real. And there's something else that I think JBS has accomplished that I'm forever grateful for. And that is, there's a whole vulnerable population out there, people who can't leave their homes and their beds. And they lean on you. You're their rabbi. You are the interdenominational rabbi. There was one individual in our synagogue who was a mentor of mine, Stanley Langer, a profoundly religious man who had an enormous impact on my life. And he would, in his last days, he would sit and watch JBS. And although he only attended an Orthodox synagogue, when Shabbat started late, he made sure that on Friday, 6 p.m., he was watching the Central Synagogue service. For that alone, you deserve so much credit. You know, there are two kinds of rabbis. There are rabbis who dance in a circle, and they dance in a circle. And there are those rabbis who don't only see the people in the circle, but they first look to see who's outside of the circle. And JBS really does both. It reaches to those within the circle, but you're really reaching out to many people who would have no contact with the Jewish community were it not for you. So, Mark, I bless you. I bless you with health, with life, with fulfillment, not just for many years to come, for many decades to come. You are really a treasure, and I respect you and love you.
Oh, that is so sweet of you, you know. And you understand, there's certain people in your life, too, that they say something like you've said to me, it means the world. You mean the world to me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mark.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about. I want to start with the book, then I want to move to some of the things you've stood for in the Jewish world. And, you know, what's interesting about your book is, and this is not the only book you've written. He's written Spiritual Activism. You have a Haggadah, Holistic Prayer, Women at Prayer, and you're involved in a book coming up, yes?
It's called Journey to Open Orthodoxy. God willing.
Okay, and you said when you write that book, when you publish a book, you'll come back.
Always.
All right.
Always a blessing.
Just wonderful. Okay, so my first question is this. By the way, do you know that I'm in a picture in that book? In your book.
I like to.
I'm in the picture of the March rally in 1985.
Really?
And one of your congregants sent me the picture. Said, "Look at that! What a kick for me to be in your book,
Right.
one way or the other." Okay.
Well, that's the power of the movement. The power of the movement was it was a people's movement.
Wasn't it?
That's what it was about.
By the way, did you understand it at the time?
I don't think I quite understood it. I think it's most of the time not post facto. It's
After
kind of
the fact,
looking back at it that one recognized what one was involved with. But although this is called Open Up the Iron Door, a memoir of a Soviet Jewry activist, it's my memoir, but it's not my memoir. I try to write it in such a way that one recognizes that this was a people's movement.
Yes.
The Soviet Jewry movement was a movement of not hundreds of thousands, of millions of people who raised a voice of moral conscience, of Jewish conscience, and made the difference, led by, I believe, people like the Jacob Birnbaums and my dear, dear friend, to whom the book is dedicated, Glenn Richter, who is
fabulous human being.
such a special neshama.
He is.
They don't get better than Glenn.
No, they don't.
We used to, whenever we protested, Glenn had certain rules. First of all, our backs always had to be up against the wall. Always. Always. And if I would be going too long, he'd circle behind the camera and he'd go like this. Avi, it's time. Enough.
Right. And this is the SSJ, which stands for?
Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry.
Right. And he and Jacob were really the founding people there.
They were the founding people, and in the first chapter, the first part of the book, I talk about a very fundamental principle of leadership. A true leadership is one who becomes involved in a cause not because it's necessarily popular, but because it's right. True leaders become involved in causes that they're not so sure they're going to win, but they jump to make a difference before there is clarity that victory is ahead. And when the Soviet Jewry movement started from 1964 to 1971, Glenn and Yaakov, they were lonely voices. The student struggle
true?
They were the only national Soviet Jewry group.
And they were ridiculed. They were belittled.
Very much so.
They were excluded. Even when you became involved, you dealt with that same kind of, what are you doing? Keep your mouth shut. You're making waves unnecessary. You tell a very powerful story in the book about a moment where somebody at the American Jewish Congress criticizes you. Do you remember that moment?
I do.
Tell it.
Well, I remember the person, but we'll
the name's irrelevant.
The name is irrelevant. At that time, Yaakov Birnbaum came up with the idea that not only should our protests be directed at the Soviet government, but it should be directed at the American government, that America was not doing enough.
Wasn't that the brilliant chidush here? It changed everything. And what SSJ did was bring America into the fight. Until America came into the fight, but the Jewish community was not on your side at the beginning, Avi.
It was
amazing in retrospect.
It was very much resisted. During those days,
Why?
It was resisted because certainly in the early 70s, Nixon wanted a rapprochement. He wanted a détente with the Soviet Union. And to protest against the American government, I think it makes American Jews feel very uncomfortable.
To this day.
They're protesting against the American government. It's not simple. And so when Yaakov came up with the idea, I think the issue there of this individual was the voice of America. The voice of America was broadcasting in every kind of language. And we said, why not broadcast in Yiddish? And there was great resistance. In this book, there is a quote, which is one of the most damning quotes. I know it's on page 82 because I've turned to it so often. It picks up a meeting between Golda Meir in the Oval Office with Nixon and with Kissinger. And this was during the Battle of Jackson-Vanik. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment fundamentally said that there can be most favored nation status and trade credits, good trade from America to the Soviet Union on one condition, that the Soviets be true to human rights, and more narrowly, that they release Soviet Jews. And Jackson was very much in favor of this. But the Nixon White House and many Jews who were close to Nixon were very opposed to it because they wanted good relations to the Soviets, and the Soviets were upset with a form of sanctions against the Soviet Union. So Golda Meir was in the Oval Office. She was pleading on behalf of Soviet Jewry, and then she leaves the Oval Office, and Nixon had tapes. And these tapes is part of the public record. Actually, it was published in the New York Times a couple of years ago. And the tape of that conversation reported Kissinger as saying the following to Nixon. This is from the tape, right after Golda Meir had left. Here's what he said. The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It gets worse. Mm-hmm. And if they put Jews in gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern. Maybe a humanitarian concern. I write, Nixon responded, quote, I know we can't blow up the world because of this. And then I continued, all of this reinforced what I heard years earlier from my parents who had friends who knew Kissinger's parents. Quote, we have great honor from our son, Kissinger's parents said, but little nachas. Mm-hmm. It says it all.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Anyway, the gentleman from the American Jewish Congress got up and said, you shouldn't make waves over this Yiddish thing on Voice of America.
Right.
And it was not the only time that you were called out in public by Jewish leadership. And
it wasn't just me. I was really part of a much, much larger team of people from the student struggle. Yitz Greenberg was involved early on. Many wonderful, wonderful people. They were tough times. There was Yossi Klein Halevi was very
12
much
years
involved.
old, you write about.
Oh, that's a great story about Yossi and Glenn. But there was one piece that he brought to the public here in America where the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was about ready to be passed. And three very prominent Jews entered into Jackson's office and asked that he withdraw the amendment. And I write here that it was reported in Ma'ariv, page 1, that Jackson said to this small delegation, even if you have decided to sacrifice the fate of Soviet Jewry, I will not sacrifice Andrei Sakharov and others who have placed their trust in me. Now, they pushed back and said they weren't there to scuttle it. They were there to have him delay it because of broader concerns with Israel. But when it comes to the Jackson-Vanik, if you've got a chance to pass it, pass it. Don't delay it, because if you delay it, you may never have a chance to push it through. Now, I want to say clearly, had I written this book 25 years ago, it would have been a much tougher book.
What do you mean?
Because there was a time, Mark, that I was really non-establishment. That I was anti-establishment. That when I was a younger man, I didn't understand the contribution that these individuals have made. I'm no longer anti-establishment. I'm non-establishment, which means I operate outside of the establishment. But Mark, I recognize that we're in a symphony. We're in an orchestra. And we may have been the drummers, but the goal of the drummer is not to drown out the pianist and the flutist, but it's to hear that voice even more profoundly and more deeply. And so I'd like to say that even those people who went in to see Jackson, who I feel did the wrong thing, I know that they were wonderful people, and I know that they meant well. And in the end, I know that they made an extraordinary contribution to the freedom of Soviet Jewry. What appeared to be a cacophony to me in those days was really a symphony, and only because Am Yisrael was united, the establishment and those who were outside of the establishment, ultimately was all of Soviet Jewry freed.
I understand, but I want to make sure you get a chance to say this. At one point, you define yourself as anti-establishment.
Right.
If you hadn't been, if Glenn Richter hadn't been, if Shlomo Riskin hadn't been, and very close to Izzy Liebler out of Australia, if he hadn't been, there would have been no Soviet Jewry movement. And, I don't know how history would have gone, but we know the success you had, you meaning the collective you. And so, what would you say to young people today if they're where you were and they're saying, Avi, it was your anti-establishment feelings which propelled you to go to an Auschwitz and to stand up for Soviet Jewry and to be willing to, take the slings and arrows. That it was, people don't remember. The Jewish community came late to this. And when they did, it was a torrent of support. And by the way, I can't meet a person who doesn't tell me they're responsible for what happened with Soviet. Every Jew I meet, they were one of the first. But you and I understand, not everybody was there at the beginning. And so, I appreciate the subtlety, the nuance of, I'm no longer anti-establishment, I'm non-establishment. But I want to know whether you're suggesting to our audience that it's bad to be anti-establishment.
I would say to young people, it's okay to be anti-establishment, but I would offer the advice, don't make the mistake that I made. You can be on a personal level, less personally strident as it relates to relationships with other people. I do regret a lot of stuff.
Did you burn bridges?
I think on some level.
And that you regret?
I do regret that. I do regret some personal interactions I had with people. I didn't understand then that they were sincere too. They had a different approach. But when the prophet Yeshayahu, when he says, V'nar katan noheg otam, that in the time of redemption, young people will lead the way. He got it
He's
right
on
on.
something, isn't he? Yeah.
Young
Yes.
people, I say to the young people, they're young, they're strong, they're full of dreams. Actualize your dreams. There's a certain naivete. Some of the best things I've done in life, I've done because I've been naive. If I were to sit down and draw up an action plan with mission and core values, I would have never moved forward. Some of the best stuff that we did because we did it instinctually.
Yeah,
we just
I
felt it was
understand.
the right thing.
I understand.
It was the right thing to do.
Okay. And again, the instinct was a good instinct. And what you hope young people have is this drive, but for good. You know, to build and not to destroy. You were never trying to destroy. You were always trying to build. And you were doing it in defense of the Jewish people. I do want you to just talk for one moment, personally, what it meant to you to have the kind of relationship you did with Avital and Natan. And were there moments, you know, behind the scenes and behind closed doors, which you will carry with you forever, that you can describe to our audience?
Right. Well, first, I do want the audience to see there's some fabulous pictures here that we found. This is a picture of
Shlomo Carlebach.
that Shlomo Carlebach as a young man, and this is the first time he ever sang Am Yisrael Chai publicly.
Really?
And that became the We Shall Overcome of the Soviet Jewry movement. And Tzvi Fishman, who in his own way did a great deal, is there with a little tape recorder, and he's taping the song Am Yisrael Chai. There were so many people who were involved. On the front cover, I didn't know this. This picture was picked at random. This man here, who I sometimes struggle with, is a young Charles Schumer. And this is, over here, this is Elizabeth Holzman.
Wow.
Great
Right.
former attorney
Yes.
general of just a great
And of course, she was a major
congresswoman.
figure in Watergate.
Major figure. Look, in terms of my relationship with Avital, I was very taken by the story of Avital and Natan Sharansky, but I really became close with Avital when Natan in the Soviet Gulag went on a real hunger strike for 130 days. There was something in me that just propelled me to do something outlandish. And against the advice of my doctors, I decided that I would, in solidarity with Natan, go on a hunger strike. And from Motzei Shabbat, beginning the end of October in 1982, for a week, I didn't eat. The only thing I did was I would drink water. And it was then that I knew Avital beforehand. I
Yes.
met her beforehand, but it was then that we really connected for the first time. And one of the reasons that Avital was so successful is that she had a wonderful relationship with the establishment, and the establishment needed her because she was such a powerful but soft-spoken spokesperson for Natan and for the larger Soviet Jewry movement. But she was never dependent upon the establishment. And one of the ways she wasn't dependent is she raised her own money. And during that week, someone who was with her, Eli Sadan, who went on to develop all the mechinot in Israel, he's the recipient of the Israeli Prize this year, he asked me whether I would be willing to fundraise for the Avital Sharansky, Natan Sharansky campaign. I knew nothing about fundraising. I don't think I had raised $2. I said, sure. And that started a very, very close relationship with the person, Avital, whom I considered to be the greatest activist of the 20th century. When she would get up to speak, this was Elijah the prophet, to whom God says, God's voice is not in the fire, it's not in the thunder, it's not in the earthquake. God's voice is kol demama daka, the soft voice. And that's the way Avital was. I can go on and on with wonderful anecdotes. I'll tell you two quick ones, if we have the time. Avital, after Brezhnev dies, we're in front of the Soviet mission in New York, 67th Street and Lexington Avenue. She gets up in front of cameras and she says, Brezhnev didn't free my husband, and therefore he died. I am warning the next leader of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, if he doesn't free Natan, he will die. I pulled her aside. I say, Avital, that's so fundamentalist. You can't say that. A year later, Andropov was gone. She gets up and she says, I warned Andropov. I told him if he doesn't free Natan, he would die. He didn't free Natan, he died. Now I'm warning Chernenko. If he doesn't free Natan, he's gone. And she meant it in the sweetest way. I pull her aside. I say, Avital, once you can get away with it. Twice? A year later, we're in front of the Soviet mission. She gets up, she says, I warned Chernenko. He didn't free Natan, he died. Now I'm warning Gorbachev. If he doesn't free Natan, something will happen. And if you ask Avital why Gorbachev is still alive, I think she would tell you. He freed Natan. The second story is, we get off a plane in Toronto. We had a fundraiser there. And there's a woman who had been a student of mine at Stern College Yeshiva University. And she's carrying an infant girl in her arms. And she walks up to Avital, tears flowing down her cheeks, and she falls on her. And she says, Avital, you're my hero. I want to introduce you to my daughter. I named my daughter Avital in your honor. And to this day, if you'll meet women who are 30, 35 years old whose name is Avital, odds are they were named in honor of Avital. She's really one of the great figures of our time. She is the epitome of the Talmudic teaching that in the place of the greatness of God, there is the humility of God. That's leadership. Real leadership is there is strength, but built into that strength is a self-effacement, is a humility. And that's Avital, may she be well, together with Natan and Rachel and Hanan, their spouses and
That's
family,
really wonderful.
forever and ever.
Can I tell you my one Avital story?
I'd love to hear it.
So I get married. We go on our honeymoon, Ruth and I. We go to New York. We're very happy. Not a lot of money, so happy to just be together. And we take a week. There's only one moment that interrupts our honeymoon. I have the chance to interview Avital Sharansky. And we have an apartment on West End Avenue, and she comes.
Wow.
This was the very first, she was in the early time lobbying. She comes in, she comes alone, there's no entourage. She is just a lovely, simple, I don't mean stupid simple, I mean unpretentious woman. She is simply there because her husband's in prison. And she wants to talk about it. And she wants the Jewish world and the world at large to know about this injustice. And we sit at a table and we talk together and we talk about, to what extent there's a Jewish consciousness of her own, and how did she meet Natan, and what is she hoping to gain. And I am struck. Boy, I fall in love with her because she is an extraordinary human being. And the loveliness you talk about, the humility you talk about, is something that comes through immediately. And it came through to me and it captivated me. And after that, I was honored to do a couple more interviews with her. And I saw her own, she went on her own journey. And in part, you were much closer to her than I wasn't close to her. But you know about this journey much more. She became a very observant member of the Orthodox community. When I met her, she was a Soviet Jew, didn't know anything, and that wasn't her identity. Her identity was, I'm a woman, I know I'm Jewish, I married Natan. He was Anatoly then. He becomes Natan after he is released. And, you know the story. They really only had a moment together as husband and wife. And then he was picked up and taken away, and she never saw him again until he was released after victory, after many, many, many years. And when you talk about how you experienced her, it also reminds me of how I experienced her, and she really is one of the unusual human beings of this world, yes?
She had also another lesson of leadership. Leaders often don't make space for others. She had this uncanny ability to inspire everyone to become involved, and that's why. Stop somebody in the street who was involved in the cause, they will say,
Yes.
I freed Natan Sharansky.
Yes.
Natan when he came to America in May of 1986, he came to the Bayit, he came to the synagogue, and it was such excitement. He spent a Shabbat with us, and he was to speak that Saturday night in the synagogue. And the synagogue is packed, and Natan was brought in a bit late, and we're waiting for him. And there's a little boy, he's tugging at my jacket, and he's saying to me in my ear, he's saying, Rabbi, where's free? So, my mind was on so many different things, but he keeps tugging at me, where's free? Over and over, where's free? And then something hit me. I looked at this child, I picked this child up, I hugged this child. This child who was 3, 4 years old, 5 years old maybe, had been in so many demonstrations in which he was screaming, free Sharansky. Mm-hmm. Mark, he thought his first name was Free. That's a movement.
Yes.
When you win the minds and the hearts and the souls of a 4 or 5 year old child who screams, where's free? What a movement. It was a great movement. And by the way, it didn't end. Here I take great exception to, let's say, a Gal Beckerman, where basically his book ends with the 87 rally.
Yes, yours goes on.
It goes on. 1/3 of the book is what happens afterwards, because that was a very dangerous time. I compare it to a voyage, to a kind of car ride. The most dangerous part of a journey is the last leg. And that last leg was very dangerous. And that was a very difficult time. We were really squaring off with the establishment constantly because they wanted Jackson Vanik waived. And we said, not until Soviet Jews are free and it's clear that they can come out. And so it was.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember that was a difficult time for you? It was a difficult time for everyone in the movement, correct?
It was
a very difficult time. And again, as we look back,
we're talking about in 1985, there may have been 250, 300 Jews who were released. The 80s were very, very difficult years. The year that Natan was released, he was released in February of 86, less than 1,000 Jews came out. We had to go into 89 until large numbers of Jews were getting out, and we were not satisfied until we were convinced that that would continue. And when the student struggle for Soviet Jewry really, if you will, closed its doors only with the fall of the Soviet Union in December of 1991.
Okay, but you say it now. It's surprising to me it was not evident at the time to Jewish leadership. It wasn't about 100 Jews. By the way, the Jewish establishment now takes enormous credit for the wave of Aliyah that went to Israel and really revitalized Israel at a critical time in Israeli history. And, another million come to America. And the audience knows I have been privileged to be involved with Russian language television as well as JBS. My entire staff is, with 3 or 4 exceptions, all are immigrants from the former Soviet Union, the vast majority of which are Jewish. And by the way, you and I understand, I think I shouldn't speak for you. Many of the people who are here at RTN, Russian Television Network of America, they had no Jewish education. They knew they were Jewish, and they knew that there was a stamp on their passport which called them a Jew more than a Russian. They often say to me, isn't it ironic? In Russia, I was the Jew. Here, I'm the Russian. And I try as much as I can not to call them Russian Jews. Those are Jews from the former Soviet Union. But when I think about the extent to which it was necessary to keep working, it reminds me that the fight you had with the establishment, it went on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And it's one thing to say, at the beginning they didn't get it. I'm asking you now, why weren't they in it for why weren't they in it from the beginning to ultimately get the millions out? Why were they willing to stop?
Look, they'd have to answer that question
You
themselves.
have no feel for this?
I would imagine their feel was that once Natan was released and the exit numbers had increased, they felt that the best way to deal with the Soviet Union was not with the stick, but with the carrot. Give them trade, and once they have the trade, then the doors would open up.
Didn't they go hand in hand?
We felt no. We felt that it was important to keep the pressure. There was a point, I write about it in the book, where the first President Bush, and he was no great friend of the State of Israel, that's for sure, when the first President Bush was more pro-Jackson Vanik than the Jewish establishment. I write about that here in the last third of the book. But one of the reasons that I wrote this book was I felt that this piece of the story, the last third of the years of this struggle to free Soviet Jewry, that had to be recorded.
Mm-hmm.
That rally in Washington was a very important rally. But for many, that this was the celebration of the freedom of Soviet Jewry, and there was very little follow-through on that. We felt that the battle and the struggle continued way afterwards. And by the way, that rally was really inspired once again by those outside of the establishment. It was inspired by Natan Sharansky. And in the beginning, the establishment said it can't be done. Jack Lew, who prays in my synagogue, the present Secretary of Treasury, tells me, I quote him here, he traveled with Natan and David Makovsky from city to city. And when it became clear that this was going to happen, then the establishment jumped on board. And that's the way it happens. Mm-hmm. That's the way it's happened throughout history. Mm-hmm. Judaism started with Abraham, who was a very lonely Jew. He was the only one who believed in God. He's Avram Ivri. The whole world, say the rabbis, was on one side of the river. He was on the other side with Sarah alone. He raised the voice until people got the message. One of my favorite rabbinic midrashim is the story of Moses and Aaron. God tells Moses, tell Pharaoh to let the Jews go. And he goes to the elders and he gets the agreement of the elders. And so Moses and Aaron with the elders, they're walking to the palace. And then the pasuk says, V'achar, and afterwards, Ba'u Moshe v'Aaron. Then Moses and Aaron came.
They were alone.
So the rabbis ask, and Rashi records, where were the elders? And there's this unbelievable image that they were walking. And the great Rashi, the 11th century commentary, he says, one by one they were dropping out. I can identify with this experience. And suddenly you turn around, there's no one there. You're there by yourself. And Moses says,
we're going to go forward anyway, right?
Think about the black civil rights movement. Dr. King had enormous influence on my life. Enormous influence as a political activist, as a social activist. When he went down south, it wasn't only white clergy who opposed him. Many of his brothers in the black community said, Brother Martin, you're a troublemaker. It was a lonely battle. The anti-war movement was a lonely battle. What's going on now with LGBT? It was a lonely battle. And I say with tears in my eyes, I came on board too late when it came to that sensitivity to the LGBT community. That's how change occurs. Mm-hmm. Change inevitably begins from the fringe, from outside of the establishment. And then when it becomes kasher, then the establishment will jump in, most often making sure to cut out those who were there in the first place. That's the way it is. And those who were there in the first place should step back and say, that's fine. We can do things that the establishment couldn't do. And by the way, the establishment could do things that we can't do. Mm-hmm. We couldn't bring out 200,000 people near the White House on that cold December day in 1987. It's true that those on the outside pushed the establishment, but the establishment deserves credit for having done that rally. Mm-hmm. Just as the State of Israel. The State of Israel was not that pro-Soviet Jewry in the beginning. They wanted better relations with the Soviets. They weren't pro-Sharansky. There's a very difficult paragraph in this book where I talk about what some Israeli officials told Avital after Natan was sentenced to a long term. So the State of Israel...
They said?
They
It's in your book.
They said to Avital, maybe you should think twice about continuing with Natan. I asked Avital permission if I can record that. He says, I'll never stop you from saying what you want to say, but when you do it in such a way that it doesn't hurt or embarrass the state of Israel. They did not want Sharansky to be the symbol because they wanted a pure Zionist. And they thought that Sharansky was a prisoner of Zion, but he was on Sakharov. He was the spokesperson for Helsinki Watch, which is a very universal human rights movement. Correct. And so they didn't want Sharansky to be front and center. But Natan taught another lesson about leadership, and that is what Natan taught Jews is that a strong sense of Jewish consciousness does not contradict our responsibility to the larger world. It's a prerequisite to it. That you can be a prisoner of Zion, languishing in prison for as long as Natan did, and at the same time, you can be the universal, you can be the spokesperson for Helsinki Watch. Mm-hmm. It's an extraordinary movement. The most important Jewish human rights movement, certainly post-Shoah. Mm-hmm. One of the most in all of Jewish history.
Absolutely.
Let me just mention this. I know we're moving to another topic. I also wrote the book because I felt it was important that young people know the names of Soviet Jewish heroes.
Like Mendelevich.
Young people don't know who Mendelevich was.
Right.
Mendelevich created the movement when he tried to, it was not a normal hijacking.
Right.
It was a 12-seater. They had every seat on the plane, and one of the passengers was Mark Dimschitz, a Jew, who was also a pilot.
Right.
They knew they were going to be apprehended by the Soviet KGB. And I said to Mendelevich, who's one of my dearest friends, I said, Yosef, even if Dimschitz would have gotten that plane up in the air, the Soviets would have not hesitated to shoot you out of the sky. And Mendelevich looked at me and he said, we were ready for that. And it reminded me of something that Martin Luther King once said. He said that if there's nothing in this world that you're ready to die for, you're not living. If there's nothing in this world that you're ready to die for, you're not living. That's Mendelevich. And our young people, they don't know Mendelevich's name. They don't know Mendelevich's name. When they don't know Ida Nudell's name, they don't know Yosef Begun's name. It shouldn't be that way. In my opinion, the struggle to free Soviet Jewry should be a course in all Jewish high schools. It should be studied. It should be studied. It should be understood. And there should be name recognition of all of the real heroes, the primary heroes from the former Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union fell, the Jewish establishment was giving awards to Gorbachev, paying him $100,000 to be a guest speaker. The same thing with Kissinger. I took great exception to that. I wrote a piece in the Law Journal when he was being honored by Cardoza. And I said, it's one thing to sit down with Gorbachev to know what he was thinking. But to give an award, my last line of that Law Journal article, I wrote it with Pam Cohen, who was then the chairperson of one of the most important organizations, the Union of Councils, which was an activist operating outside of the establishment organization. The last line we wrote was, giving an award to Gorbachev is like giving an award to Pharaoh for letting the Jews go. So I wanted to write the record, and this is a humble contribution.
It is a marvelous. Can I ask you one more thing?
Whatever money comes in on this book, by the way, goes to indigent Jews from the former Soviet Union.
That's lovely. You write in this book, there's a chapter, Love-Hate with Meir Kahane. Mm-hmm. Okay, speak to me about him and what he was to you.
I loved Meir. He inspired me on many, many levels, but we really parted company. We parted company in a serious way on the use of violence as a means of social action. He felt that it was important, and I'm unalterably opposed to the use of any form of violence as a means of. I'm a great supporter of the Israeli army, and there is no holier Jew than one who serves in the army, but that is a state army. That's very different than an individual who decides that I want to be violent. And we parted company. I felt that, look, he's not here to defend himself, and I wish I had another few minutes with him, because I would just like to give him a hug, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
We parted in a very bitter way, But there were times I felt the way he spoke about Jews who were not Orthodox was unacceptable. The language that he used about Arabs, I felt was unacceptable, unacceptable to me. He was murdered on a Monday night, and the next night, Tuesday night, I was supposed to debate him in my synagogue. Meir Kahane would have told you that his greatest night was when he debated Alan Dershowitz in our synagogue. That was an extraordinary, extraordinary night. And Kahane held Dershowitz, and Dershowitz was a dear, dear friend of mine. I am one of his pro bono clients. Dershowitz defended me on the Auschwitz situation, so we got to the point where I was supposed to debate Meir. And what occurred was I called him because there was tension between the Jewish and the black community in Brooklyn. It was in November of '91, and I called Kahane and I said, Meir, this is not the time. He said, you made the commitment, I'm coming. This was Meir. Before I could turn around, in my own community in Riverdale, he has his chevra putting up signs, Avi Weiss is a wimp. He's coming. I'm giving a class Monday night, and I'm thinking to myself as I'm giving the class, oh my God, I got to deal with Rabbi Kahane. He's going to come tomorrow night. And as I finish the class, I get the call that he was assassinated. I've been told that his last words were a response to a question. He was asked, where are we tomorrow night? And his last words were, I'm up in Riverdale and I'm going to really whip Avi. So I loved him, but we parted on the issues, and by the time we parted, there was real bitterness. I wish it wasn't the case, but real bitterness between us.
Are you making a distinction between the ideology and the person? Were you able to have a warm relationship with him personally, even though you seriously disagreed with his orientation? Or did it affect your ability to be? I mean, you say now you loved him. Was that how you felt even then, or is it only in retrospect?
I loved him because he was an inspiration in my life. He inspired me towards activism, certainly in the early years. He inspired many, many people, but we did part company in a very, very serious way. For Meir, if he disagreed with you ideologically, that was the end of your personal relationship. He couldn't distinguish between the two. He was an Ohev Yisrael. I think he loved Jews. And I think he could have been one of the great, great leaders if he would not have been as absolutist, and if he would have said, I'm not going to become involved in any form of violence, but he didn't have that capacity.
Lahavdil, who is it in this movement that you thought embodied the best of the movement and not only inspired you, but you were always thrilled to be in their presence and they helped you become more of what you wanted to be? From this movement, who was it?
I wouldn't hesitate for a moment. It was the person to whom I dedicated this book. This man, Glenn Richter. He was the embodiment. He was the person who inspired me. He is, in the broader Jewish world, he's not known.
I know.
But
it's always surprising to me.
He is one of the 36 greats, one of the 36 tzaddikim. He's a beautiful man. I don't know if you know this, he and Lenore, in their personal life, they had 2 children, 2 young daughters. Both of them died at a very, very young age. He endured that tragedy, and he went on. And I'm forever beholden to Glenn for having inspired me, for having inspired a generation. It says here, for Glenn Richter, tzaddik of the Soviet Jewry movement.
Good for you.
And that's who he was. And I think Soviet Jews themselves, if you speak to Natan, speak to Yosef,
yes,
speak to Joseph,
they know.
They know.
They know.
They know. And it's often that way.
Okay.
It's often this unknown person who plays the most major role.
Okay. Just to be able to bring your sense of what this movement was, to be able to tell people about your book, and then have you recall and remind us of the importance of this movement and who was there and why it is, it is something that as you say, every young Jew should know. Very, very important. Thank you.
The key
very,
thing,
very
though,
much.
is to remember that I was just part of something.
I understand.
So much
But
bigger.
you were, by the way, you were only a part,
Right.
but you were an important part. And every one of these
Everyone was important.
Okay. That's part one of my meeting with Avi Weiss of the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, founder of YCT, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and Yeshivat Maharat. And, again, he's the creator of an idea called Open Orthodoxy. But he's also the author of this spectacular book. I really hope you make sure you have, it becomes part of your home library. Open Up the Iron Door, Memoirs of a Soviet Jewish Activist. Again, a wonderful read. Once you start it, I warn you, you will not be able to put it down. It would make a wonderful gift for someone you love, if not for your own, or in addition to your own Jewish library. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed by Avi Weiss. If you'd like to be in touch with him, you can do so through me. Email me and I will forward your emails on to him. Please, email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I love receiving your comments. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.